Don't end up like your mother, marrying some dirt-poor farmer and living in the middle of nowhere with nothing to show for your life." My sister Vanessa's voice rang out across the elegant ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton, her words cutting through the gentle music and happy chatter of my daughter Emily's wedding reception like a knife. 200 guests turned to stare at us, the joyful atmosphere suddenly thick with shocked silence and uncomfortable tension. I stood there frozen near the dessert table, my face burning with humiliation as Vanessa continued her cruel speech that nobody had asked her to make. Her expensive champagne glass held high like she was toasting rather than destroying a beautiful moment. "My name is Catherine, and I'm 54 years old. The man Vanessa was mocking so publicly, my husband of 30 years, stood beside me with his weathered hands clenched into fists and his jaw tight with controlled anger. This moment, this terrible public humiliation at our daughter's wedding, was about to become the catalyst for the most satisfying revelation of my entire life. But to understand the full scope of what happened next and why it mattered so deeply, I need to take you back to the beginning of my story. I met James 32 years ago, when I was 22 years old and fresh out of college with a degree in literature and absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I'd grown up in Seattle in an upper-middle-class family where my father was a successful corporate lawyer and my mother was a doctor. My sister Vanessa, 3 years older than me, had followed perfectly in their footsteps by going to law school and joining a prestigious firm right after graduation. She was everything my parents wanted: ambitious, wealthy, status-conscious, always chasing the next impressive achievement or expensive possession. I'd never quite fit that mold despite my parents' constant pressure and disappointment. I loved reading and writing. I valued experiences over possessions. I wanted a life that felt meaningful, rather than just impressive to others. After college, I took a job teaching English at a small rural high school about 2 hours outside of Seattle, partly to figure out what I wanted, and partly to escape the suffocating expectations of my family. That's where I met James. He came to the school one afternoon to give a presentation to the agriculture class about sustainable farming practices and land management. He was 25, tall and strong with kind eyes and calloused hands, speaking passionately about soil health and crop rotation and water conservation. Most people would have found it boring, but I was captivated by his intelligence and his obvious deep connection to the land he worked. We started talking after his presentation when I approached him with genuine questions about his work. That conversation led to coffee, which led to dinner, which led to long walks on his family's farm, where he showed me the orchards and fields and explained his vision for sustainable agriculture. He wasn't just a farmer in the stereotypical sense. He had a degree in agricultural science from Washington State University. He was implementing innovative techniques he'd researched extensively. He was passionate about environmental stewardship and producing healthy food. I fell in love with him quickly and completely. He was intelligent, kind, hardworking, genuine, and grounded in a way that nobody in my family had ever been. He didn't care about impressing people or accumulating status symbols. He cared about doing meaningful work, taking care of the land, building something lasting and valuable. When I told my parents I was dating a farmer, their reaction was immediate and intensely negative. My mother actually laughed as if I'd told a joke, then realized I was serious and her face fell into disappointment and concern. My father asked bluntly what kind of future I thought I could have with someone who worked with his hands and lived on a farm. Vanessa was the cruelest, calling James a hick and a peasant, saying I was throwing away my education and potential to play house in the countryside, with someone who would never be able to provide me with a decent lifestyle. But I didn't care about their judgment or their narrow definition of success. I loved James, and more importantly, I loved the life we were building together. 6 months after we met, he proposed to me in the middle of one of his apple orchards at sunset, and I said yes without hesitation, despite knowing my family would be furious. The wedding was small and simple, held on the farm with about 50 guests, mostly James's family and our friends from the rural community. My parents came but made their disapproval obvious throughout the entire ceremony, sitting stiffly in the front row with tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Vanessa came with her new lawyer boyfriend and spent the whole time making snide comments about the rustic venue and the quaint decorations, using air quotes and a condescending tone that made several guests uncomfortable. After the wedding, My relationship with my family became increasingly strained and distant. They made it clear they thought I'd made a terrible mistake, that I was wasting my potential, that I'd regret choosing love and happiness over financial security and social status. Vanessa was particularly cruel, never missing an opportunity to compare her life to mine in ways that highlighted how much more successful and impressive she thought she was. She married her lawyer boyfriend 2 years after my wedding in an extravagant ceremony at a 5-star hotel that cost more than most people's annual salary. She made pointed comments about how nice it was to have a real wedding at a proper venue, unlike some people who got married in a barn. She bought a huge house in an exclusive Seattle neighborhood and filled it with expensive furniture and artwork. She drove luxury cars, wore designer clothes, took exotic vacations, and never failed to mention these things whenever we spoke, which became increasingly rare. Meanwhile, James and I built our life on the farm. I continued teaching at the local high school for several years, genuinely enjoying working with students who appreciated learning and weren't just going through the motions to get into prestigious colleges. James worked incredibly hard expanding and improving the farm, implementing new sustainable techniques, building relationships with local restaurants and farmers markets who valued high-quality organic produce. We had our daughter Emily when I'd been married for 2 years, and she grew up running through orchards and helping in gardens, and learning to appreciate nature and hard work. We weren't wealthy by Vanessa's standards. We drove practical trucks, lived in a comfortable but modest farmhouse that James's grandfather had built, wore jeans and boots more often than dress clothes. But we were happy, genuinely happy in a way that my sister's expensive lifestyle never seemed to provide, despite all her bragging. What my family didn't know, what Vanessa especially had no idea about, was that James wasn't just a simple farmer barely scraping by like they'd always assumed. His family had owned their land for 4 generations, over 300 acres of prime agricultural property that had appreciated enormously in value over the decades. James had expanded the operation significantly, buying adjacent property, specialty markets. More significantly, about 10 years into our marriage, James had made a brilliant investment decision that his agricultural science background had prepared him to recognize. He'd seen the growing demand for organic, locally sourced food and the potential for agritourism before most people in the industry. He'd invested heavily in organic certification, built a farm-to-table restaurant on our property that became incredibly popular, and developed an agritourism operation that brought in substantial revenue from weddings, corporate retreats, and educational tours. The farm had become extraordinarily successful and profitable, generating millions in annual revenue. James had also made smart real estate investments, buying undervalued rural properties and either developing them or selling them at significant profit. We'd invested wisely in stocks and bonds, built a substantial retirement portfolio, and yes, had acquired other properties and business interests beyond just the farm, but we'd kept all of this private and quiet. We still lived in the same comfortable farmhouse because we loved it and saw no reason to build some ostentatious mansion just to impress people. We still drove trucks because they were practical for farm work. We still wore jeans and boots because that's what felt authentic to who we were. We didn't broadcast our wealth or success because it wasn't important to us to prove anything to anyone. We'd established a trust fund for Emily's education that had grown substantially over the years. We donated quietly to local charities and community organizations. We employed dozens of people at fair wages with good benefits. We lived well below our means not because we had to, but because we chose to, because ostentatious displays of wealth weren't aligned with our values. My family remained completely oblivious to all of this. In their minds, I was still poor Catherine, who'd married a simple farmer and lived a small, insignificant life in the countryside. Vanessa never missed an opportunity to remind me of this perceived disparity between our lives, often in cutting ways that revealed just how much she valued money and status over genuine happiness or meaningful relationships. When Emily got engaged to her boyfriend Marcus, a wonderful young man who worked in environmental consulting, James and I were thrilled for her. We offered to pay for the wedding, wanting to give our daughter the celebration she deserved. Emily had expensive taste and big dreams for her special day, and we were more than happy and financially able to make those dreams come true. Emily wanted a wedding at the Ritz-Carlton, one of the most prestigious and expensive hotels in Seattle. She wanted a designer dress, a renowned photographer, Flowers that cost more than a car, a band that had played for celebrities, the finest food and champagne. The total cost for the wedding she envisioned came to over $300,000. An absurd amount by most standards, but we could afford it easily, and wanted Emily to have everything she wanted for her special day. What made this particularly ironic was that the Ritz-Carlton hotel where Emily wanted to get married wasn't just some random expensive venue. James actually owned it. Well, not personally. He owned it through one of his investment companies as part of a real estate portfolio he'd built over 20 years. He owned several properties, actually, including 2 other hotels, several commercial buildings, and various residential developments. But he'd kept this quiet, conducting business through corporate entities and managers, maintaining his privacy and his identity as primarily a farmer. My family had no idea about any of this. When we told them Emily was getting married at the Ritz-Carlton, Vanessa's first response was condescending concern about how we could possibly afford such an expensive venue. She actually offered to help pay for it, in that patronizing way that made it clear she thought we were in over our heads financially, and she was generously stepping in to save us from embarrassment. I'd politely declined her offer, saying we had it covered, but she'd persisted in her concern about our finances throughout the wedding planning process. She kept making comments about how we didn't need to bankrupt ourselves just to keep up appearances, how it was okay to have a modest wedding that fit our budget, how nobody would judge us for choosing something more appropriate to our circumstances. The truth was that the $300,000 wedding Emily wanted represented about what James earned in passive income in less than 2 weeks. But we let Vanessa maintain her assumptions, because correcting her would have required revealing information we preferred to keep private. The wedding day arrived, and it was absolutely beautiful. Emily looked stunning in her designer gown. The ballroom was decorated magnificently with thousands of white roses and romantic lighting. The food was exceptional. The band was incredible. James had worn a custom suit for the occasion and looked distinguished and handsome, though still somehow maintaining that grounded, humble quality that I loved about him. My parents attended, now elderly and slightly mellowed with age, but still maintaining their disappointment that I'd never achieved the kind of conventional success they valued. Vanessa arrived with her husband Richard, also a lawyer, both of them dripping in expensive jewelry and designer clothes, ready to show off their wealth and status to anyone who would pay attention. The ceremony was perfect, Emily and Marcus exchanging vows that were heartfelt and beautiful. But it was during the reception that everything exploded in the most satisfying way possible. Vanessa had been drinking champagne steadily throughout the evening, getting progressively more loose-tongued and obnoxious. She'd made several cutting remarks already about the cost of the wedding, saying things like, "Well, Catherine, I hope you didn't mortgage the farm to pay for all this. And I'm impressed you managed to pull off something this nice. I really didn't think you had it in you." I'd ignored these comments, refusing to let her ruin Emily's special day with her pettiness. But then, during the dancing portion of the evening, Vanessa apparently decided to make an impromptu speech. She grabbed a microphone from the band despite nobody asking her to say anything, tapping it loudly to get everyone's attention. She started by congratulating Emily, saying what a beautiful bride she was and how wonderful the wedding had been, but then her tone shifted, becoming pointed and cruel in that way only Vanessa could manage while still pretending to be complimentary. "Emily, darling, you've done so well for yourself," she said, her words slightly slurred from the champagne. "You got a good education. You found a successful man with a real career. You're starting your adult life with so many opportunities and possibilities." And she paused dramatically, looking directly at me. "Don't end up like your mother, marrying some dirt-poor farmer and living in the middle of nowhere with nothing to show for your life. Choose ambition. Choose success. Choose a future that matters." The ballroom went absolutely silent. 200 guests stared at Vanessa in shock, then at me and James, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Emily's face had gone pale with anger and embarrassment at her aunt's behavior. Marcus looked furious. My parents looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything to defend me, which was typical of them. James's hand found mine, squeezing it gently. I looked up at him and saw something in his eyes, not hurt or shame, but rather a calm determination. He nodded at me slightly as if to say it's time, and I knew he was right. We'd kept our privacy for 30 years, but Vanessa had finally pushed too far, had been too publicly cruel, had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Before either of us could respond to Vanessa's cruel speech, a man in an impeccable suit approached our table from across the ballroom. I recognized him as Thomas Chen, the general manager of the Ritz-Carlton, though most of the guests wouldn't have known who he was. He'd been moving through the reception periodically, ensuring everything was running smoothly, as managers do at high-profile events. Thomas walked directly to our table with a concerned expression on his professional face. He nodded respectfully to James, then turned to address the room, gently taking the microphone from a confused Vanessa, who reluctantly surrendered it. "Excuse me, everyone. I apologize for the interruption," Thomas said smoothly, his voice carrying authority and polish. "I'm Thomas Chen, general manager of this hotel. I couldn't help but overhear the last comment, and I feel compelled to address a significant misunderstanding before it goes any further." The room was completely silent now, everyone's attention focused on Thomas. Vanessa looked annoyed at having her moment interrupted. My parents looked confused. Emily looked hopeful, like she knew something was about to shift dramatically. Thomas continued. "The gentleman who was just referred to as a dirt-poor farmer," he gestured toward James with obvious respect, "is actually the owner of this hotel. Mr. James Thornton owns the Ritz-Carlton Seattle, along with several other properties in this city and throughout the state. He's been one of the most successful real estate investors and agricultural entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest for over 2 decades. The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that massive ballroom. 200 guests stared at James and me with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to dawning realization. Vanessa's face had gone from smug superiority to pale confusion to bright red embarrassment in the space of about 10 seconds. She started to speak, but Thomas wasn't finished. "In fact," Thomas said, pulling out his phone and reading from what was clearly prepared information, "Mr. Thornton's business portfolio includes this hotel, the Cascade Mountain Resort, the Parkside Inn downtown, approximately 1,800 acres of agricultural land operated as Thornton Family Farms, which supplies over 40 high-end restaurants throughout the region, 3 farm-to-table restaurants including the award-winning Harvest Table, numerous residential and commercial properties, and various other investments. His estimated net worth, according to the last Business Journal profile done 2 years ago, is somewhere in the range of $75 to $80 million, though he's famously private about his finances, so the actual number could be substantially higher." The gasps from around the room were audible and widespread. Conversations erupted at multiple tables as guests turned to each other in shock, processing this information that completely contradicted whatever assumptions they'd made about the bride's parents. I saw several of James's business associates and friends from the farming community smiling knowingly, clearly already aware of the truth and enjoying watching it finally come to light. Vanessa looked like she might faint. She'd gone from red to pale to slightly green, her expensive champagne glass shaking in her hand. Richard, her husband, was staring at James with his mouth literally hanging open. My parents looked absolutely stunned. My mother's hand clutched to her chest dramatically. Thomas handed the microphone back to Vanessa with a polite smile, but she didn't take it. He set it down on a nearby table instead. "Thank you all for your attention," he said smoothly. "I just wanted to clarify that particular misconception before it caused any further awkwardness. Please, continue enjoying this beautiful wedding celebration." He nodded respectfully to James again, then melted back into the crowd of guests, disappearing into his professional role of managing the event. But the damage, or rather the revelation, had been done. The carefully maintained secret that James and I had kept for 30 years was now completely exposed to everyone in that room. Emily stood up from the head table where she'd been sitting with Marcus, her face bright with vindication and no small amount of satisfaction. She walked over to where Vanessa still stood frozen near our table, took the microphone Thomas had set down, and addressed the room herself. "Everyone, this is my wedding, so I think I'm entitled to say a few things," Emily began, her voice steady and clear, despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "My Aunt Vanessa has spent my entire life making cruel comments about my parents, about how my mom wasted her potential by marrying my dad, about how we're poor and insignificant compared to her fancy lawyer lifestyle. She's never missed an opportunity to make my mother feel small, or to dismiss my father's accomplishments. Emily's voice grew stronger, more passionate. What Vanessa never bothered to learn, because she was too busy judging people based on superficial markers of success, is that my parents are two of the most successful, accomplished, and genuinely good people I've ever known. My dad built a sustainable farming operation that's become a model for environmental agriculture. He provides good jobs to dozens of families. He's invested in this community and this region in meaningful ways. He and my mom have donated millions to local charities and schools without ever seeking recognition or credit. I saw several guests nodding in agreement, particularly those from the rural community who knew James's reputation and contributions. Emily continued. And my mom gave up her family's approval and support because she chose love and genuine happiness over impressing people who valued status more than character. She's been an amazing teacher who's influenced hundreds of students over the years. She raised me to value kindness and integrity and hard work over material possessions and superficial success. Emily looked directly at Vanessa now, her gaze steady and unflinching. So, Aunt Vanessa, your comment about me not ending up like my mother? I can only hope I end up exactly like her. I hope I find a partnership as strong and loving as my parents have. I hope I build a life as meaningful and rich as theirs. I hope I have the courage to choose authenticity over approval, just like my mom did when she married my dad despite people like you telling her she was making a mistake. The room erupted in applause. Genuine, enthusiastic applause that started with Marcus standing and clapping at the head table and spread quickly through the entire ballroom. People were standing, applauding, some even whistling their support. James and I stood as well, and I found myself pulled into a fierce hug by my daughter while the applause continued. Vanessa stood frozen in the middle of this ovation, her face now cycling through various shades of red and white as the full scope of her humiliation sank in. She'd publicly mocked and belittled us in front of 200 people, and now those same 200 people knew that everything she'd said was not only cruel, but completely, objectively wrong. The poor farmers she'd dismissed were actually wealthier and more successful than she'd ever be, and everyone now knew it. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Richard grabbed her arm, clearly wanting to leave before things got worse, but Vanessa was rooted to the spot in shock and embarrassment. My parents finally found their voices. My mother stood up from their table, looking at James and me with an expression that was difficult to read. Part shock, part confusion, part something that might have been regret or shame. "Catherine," my mother said slowly, "why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think?" "Let you think what?" I asked, finding my own voice finally. "Let you think we were poor? Let you think I'd made a mistake? You never asked about our lives with any genuine interest, Mother. You just assumed we were struggling and judged us based on those assumptions. You decided 30 years ago that James wasn't good enough because he worked with his hands and lived on a farm, and nothing I could have said would have changed your mind. But if we'd known he was successful," my father started, "then you would have approved of my choice based on his bank account rather than his character." I interrupted. "That's exactly the problem, Dad. Your love and approval have always been conditional on meeting your standards of conventional success and status. You couldn't see value in anything that didn't fit your narrow definition of achievement." I turned to look at Vanessa, who was still standing there looking shell-shocked and pale. "And you," I said directly to my sister for the first time in a long time, "you've spent 30 years being cruel to me because you thought you were better than me. You measured success purely in terms of money and status symbols and impressive credentials. You never once asked if I was happy or fulfilled or living a meaningful life. You just assumed I was miserable and poor because I didn't choose the path you valued." Vanessa finally found her voice, though it came out shaky and defensive. I just thought, you thought I was beneath you," I said simply. "You thought you'd won some competition I didn't even know we were having. You thought your expensive house and luxury car and fancy job made you more valuable as a human being than someone who grows food and teaches children and lives quietly in the countryside." James spoke up then, his voice calm but firm. "I've never cared about what you thought of me, Vanessa. Your opinion has never mattered to me because it was always based on superficial things that have nothing to do with who I actually am or what I value. But when you publicly humiliate my wife at our daughter's wedding, When you try to use us as a cautionary tale to diminish Catherine in front of everyone we love, that crosses a line I can't ignore." He paused, looking around the ballroom at all the guests who were listening to every word with rapt attention. "We've kept our privacy about our business success, because that's not what defines us, or our marriage or our life together. We're successful, yes, but that's not the important part. The important part is that we built a life based on love and shared values and genuine partnership. We raised a daughter who knows her worth isn't tied to her income or her possessions. We've contributed to our community in meaningful ways. We've stayed true to ourselves even when people like you judged us for it." The room was silent again, but this time, it was a respectful, attentive silence rather than shocked silence. People were nodding, clearly moved by what James was saying. "So yes, I own this hotel," James continued. "I own several properties and businesses. Catherine and I are very comfortable financially, but that's honestly the least interesting thing about us, or our life together. The truly valuable things we have, our marriage, our daughter, our integrity, our community relationships, our peace of mind, those can't be bought or sold or measured in bank statements. And those are the things you've never been able to see or value, because you're too busy counting money and collecting status symbols." Vanessa made a small sound that might have been a sob, or might have been just a sharp intake of breath. Richard was pulling at her arm more insistently now, clearly desperate to leave before the situation deteriorated further. But before they could escape, Emily stepped forward with something else to say. "Aunt Vanessa, before you go, there's one more thing you should know," Emily said, her voice softer now, but still firm. "My parents paid for this entire wedding. Every penny. The venue, the flowers, the food, the band, my dress, all of it. Do you know how much this wedding cost?" Vanessa shook her head mutely, her eyes wide. $312,000, Emily said clearly. "My parents paid for all of it without blinking, without complaining, without making me feel guilty or indebted. They did it because they love me and wanted me to have the wedding of my dreams. Meanwhile, you offered to help pay. For it not because you wanted to be generous, but because you thought we couldn't afford it and you wanted to feel superior by playing the wealthy benefactor, swooping in to save us from embarrassment." The look on Vanessa's face suggested Emily had hit that nail directly on the head. That had been exactly her motivation for offering financial help. Not generosity, but superiority. Not kindness, but control. "So thank you for the offer," Emily continued, "but we definitely didn't need it. My parents are doing just fine. Better than fine, actually. And more importantly, they're good people who've earned every bit of success they have through hard work and integrity and smart decisions. That's more than I can say for some people who inherit family money and coast on prestigious job titles while looking down on everyone they consider beneath them." That last comment was clearly directed at Vanessa, who had indeed inherited a substantial trust fund from our grandmother and had always conveniently left that detail out when bragging about her financial success. Her face flushed an even deeper shade of red at having that particular fact called out so publicly. Richard finally succeeded in pulling Vanessa toward the exit. They made their way through the crowd of guests who parted to let them through, many faces showing expressions of disapproval or satisfaction at seeing Vanessa taken down several pegs. As they reached the ballroom doors, Vanessa looked back once at where James and I stood with Emily, her expression unreadable. Shame, anger, regret, embarrassment, all mixed together. Then they were gone, leaving through the ornate doors, and presumably heading straight for their car to escape as quickly as possible. The silence lasted another beat before the band, reading the room perfectly, started playing again, launching into an upbeat song that signaled the party should continue, despite the dramatic confrontation that had just occurred. Gradually, conversations resumed and people returned to dancing and celebrating, but many guests came up to us throughout the rest of the evening to express support, to share that they'd always admired James's work, or appreciated my teaching, to say how much they'd enjoyed seeing someone who'd been cruel and judgmental get confronted with reality so publicly and thoroughly. My parents approached us about 30 minutes after Vanessa had fled, both of them looking uncomfortable and uncertain. They'd been sitting at their table in stunned silence, occasionally speaking to each other in low voices, but mostly just processing what they'd learned and witnessed. "Catherine, James, my father said formally, as if we were business associates rather than family. We owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. My mother nodded, her eyes glistening with what might have been tears. We've been terribly wrong about so many things for so many years, she said softly. We judged your marriage and your choices based on our own limited perspective and values. We never gave James a fair chance or tried to understand the life you were building together. I looked at them both, these parents who had been so distant and disapproving for 3 decades, and felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Part of me wanted to accept their apology immediately, to restore the relationship I'd always wished we could have. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt and dismissed for so long, was wary and skeptical. Why now? I asked directly. Why apologize now that you know James is wealthy? Would you be apologizing if he was just a regular farmer without millions in the bank? My father had the grace to look ashamed at that question. He hesitated, clearly wrestling with his own biases and motivations. I want to say yes, he said slowly. I want to believe we would have eventually recognized our mistakes regardless. But honestly, I don't know. The truth is that learning about James's success forced us to confront our prejudices in a way we've been avoiding for 30 years. At least that's honest, James said quietly. Most people would lie and say the money doesn't matter. My mother spoke up again, her voice trembling slightly. But I hope, that the real lesson here isn't about money at all. It's about the fact that we judged your entire life and marriage based on superficial criteria, without ever really looking at who you were or what you'd built together. You could have been truly struggling financially, and that still wouldn't have justified our behavior, or our dismissal of your happiness. She paused, wiping at her eyes. I've watched you two tonight, really watched you for maybe the first time in years. The way you interact with each other, the way people respond to you, the incredible young woman you raised together. You have something real and valuable that has nothing to do with bank accounts or property ownership. And we've missed 30 years of being part of that, because we were too proud and too narrow-minded to see past our own expectations. I felt tears forming in my own eyes now. I'd waited 3 decades to hear something like this from my parents. To have them acknowledge that their judgment had been wrong and hurtful. To see that genuine happiness and strong relationships might be more valuable than impressive credentials and social status. James must have sensed how emotional I was becoming because he wrapped his arm around my waist supportively. His presence grounded me, reminded me that I had him regardless of what happened with my parents, that I'd built a beautiful life even without their approval. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully to my parents. I really do. But you need to understand that 30 years of rejection and disapproval doesn't get erased by one apology, even a sincere one. You made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like my choices were foolish, like my life was worthless, because it didn't look like the life you wanted me to have. You're right, my father acknowledged. We can't undo those years or take back the things we said and the support we didn't give, but we'd like to try to do better going forward if you'll let us. We'd like to actually get to know you both and be part of Emily's life in a real way. I looked up at James questioningly. He squeezed my waist and nodded slightly, leaving the decision to me. He'd support whatever I chose. I knew that without him having to say it. I think, I said slowly, that will depend on whether this change is real and lasting, or just a temporary reaction to being shocked by unexpected information. If you actually want to build a relationship based on accepting us as we are and valuing what we value, then yes, I'd like to try. But if this is just about assuaging your guilt, or being able to tell people you're connected to successful people, then no thank you. We'll prove it's real, my mother said, with more conviction in her voice. We'll show you through our actions, not just words, and we understand if you need time to trust that we mean it. We talked for a while longer, working through some of the hurt and misunderstanding of 3 decades in the limited time available at a wedding reception. It wasn't a complete reconciliation or healing. That would take much more time and effort if it happened at all. But it was at least a start, a crack in the wall that had stood between us for so long. When my parents finally returned to their table, Emily came over and hugged us both fiercely. I'm so proud of you both, she said emotionally, the way you handled that. The way you stood up for yourselves and your values without being cruel back. That's who I want to be when I grow up. You're already grown up, sweetheart, James said with a slight smile. And you're already exactly who you should be. We're the ones who are proud of you. The reception continued until late into the night, the earlier drama not dampening the celebration, but somehow making it even more meaningful. Guests danced and laughed and celebrated Emily and Marcus's marriage with genuine joy and energy. Many people who'd witnessed the confrontation with Vanessa came up to share their own stories of being judged or dismissed based on superficial criteria, of choosing authentic happiness over conventional success, of learning that wealth and status don't necessarily correlate with goodness or fulfillment. Around midnight, as the party was finally winding down and guests were starting to leave, Thomas Chen approached us again. He'd been a constant professional presence throughout the evening, ensuring everything ran smoothly despite the dramatic interruption to the festivities earlier. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Thornton," Thomas said with a respectful nod. "I apologize if my intervention earlier was overstepping. I just couldn't stand by and let someone malign you so publicly in your own hotel without correcting the record." James smiled warmly and shook Thomas's hand firmly. "You didn't overstep at all, Thomas. You did exactly what needed to be done. I appreciate you stepping in when you did. Catherine has told me many times over the years that we should be more public about our business success," Thomas continued. "She thought it might prevent these kinds of misunderstandings and judgments. But I always felt our privacy was important and valuable. It is important," I agreed. "And I don't regret keeping things private all these years. But I'm not sorry the truth came out tonight either. Sometimes people need to be confronted with reality to recognize how wrong their assumptions have been. The hotel is at your disposal for as long as you'd like to stay tonight," Thomas said. "We've reserved the penthouse suite for you both. It seemed appropriate given the circumstances." We thanked him and eventually made our way to the penthouse suite he'd mentioned. It was luxurious and beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline lit up against the night sky. James and I stood together at those windows, his arms wrapped around me from behind, both of us processing everything that had happened that evening. "Are you okay?" James asked softly, his breath warm against my ear. "I'm better than okay," I said honestly. "I spent 30 years feeling like I had to justify my life choices to people who would never understand or approve. Tonight that weight finally lifted. They all know the truth now. Or at least part of it. The money part," James said with slight irony in his tone. "Yes, the money part," I acknowledged. "Which is unfortunate in a way because I wish they could see the real value in our life that has nothing to do with money. But maybe this will open the door to them understanding the deeper things eventually." James turned me around to face him, his hands cupping my face gently. "Catherine, you are the best decision I ever made. The smartest investment, the most valuable thing I have. Everything I've built, everything I've achieved, it all matters only because I've shared it with you." I kissed him then, deeply and passionately, reminded once again why I'd chosen this man over my family's approval 30 years ago. He'd proven every day since that he was worth it, that choosing love and authenticity over status and approval had been the right decision. We stayed up talking for a long time that night, sitting on the comfortable couch in that penthouse suite, reviewing not just the drama of the evening, but the entire journey of our 30 years together. We talked about the early days when we were young and so certain of our love despite everyone's warnings. We talked about building the farm and watching it grow beyond our initial dreams. We talked about raising Emily and instilling in her the values that mattered most to us. We talked about the quiet satisfaction of living according to our principles, even when it meant being judged and dismissed by people who should have supported us. And we talked about the future, about what would come next, now that our carefully guarded privacy had been blown wide open by an evening's drama. "Some things will change," James acknowledged. "People will treat us differently now that they know about the money and the properties and the success. Some people will suddenly want to be friends who never gave us the time of day before. And we'll handle that the same way we've handled everything else," I said firmly. "With integrity, and by staying true to who we are regardless of how others see us or treat us." "Exactly," James agreed, pulling me closer against him. The money was never the point. The success was never what mattered. What mattered was building a life we believed in with someone we loved. Everything else was just details. The next morning, we woke up to dozens of messages and missed calls. Some were from wedding guests, thanking us for the beautiful celebration and commenting on the previous evening's revelations. Some were from people in the community who'd heard about what happened and wanted to express support. And quite a few were from business associates and acquaintances who'd suddenly remembered we existed now that our net worth was public knowledge. But there were 3 messages that stood out from the rest. The first was from my mother, sent early that morning. "Catherine, your father and I have been up all night talking. We want you to know that we meant what we said last night. We've been wrong for so long, and we want to do better. Please give us a chance to prove it. We love you. We should have said that more often over the years. We should have shown it. We're sorry. Mom." The second message was from Emily. "Mom and Dad, thank you for the most amazing wedding anyone could ask for. Not just because of how beautiful it was, but because you showed everyone what real love and partnership looks like. Marcus and I are starting our marriage with you two as our example of what we want to build. I love you both so much." The third message was from a number I didn't recognize at first, but when I opened it, I realized it was from Vanessa. "Catherine, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I've been cruel and judgmental and wrong for 30 years. I've measured everything by the wrong standards and convinced myself I was better than you when the truth is I've always been jealous of what you had with James. You chose love over approval, and you built something real. I chose status over authenticity, and I'm miserable. My marriage is hollow. My life feels empty. Last night forced me to see that. I don't expect forgiveness, and I understand if you never want to speak to me again. But I needed you to know that I finally see the truth. You won. You always won. I was just too blind and too proud to see it." Vanessa I showed both messages to James as we lay in bed in that luxurious penthouse suite. He read them carefully, his expression thoughtful. "What do you want to do?" he asked, leaving the decision to me as he always did when it came to my family relationships. I thought about it for a long moment, considering the 3 decades of hurt and judgment and distance. I thought about my parents who were finally, possibly maybe seeing past their narrow definitions of success. I thought about my sister who'd been so cruel, but seemed to be having some kind of genuine reckoning with her own choices and values. And I thought about the life James and I had built together, the daughter we'd raised, the community we'd contributed to, the love we'd maintained through everything. I thought about the fact that we'd lived according to our values even when it cost us family relationships, and how that integrity had sustained us through 3 decades. I think, I said slowly, that I respond to my parents and Emily with love and gratitude. I think I tell my parents I'm willing to try rebuilding a relationship if they're truly committed to changing, but that it will take time and consistent effort from them to repair what's been broken. "And Vanessa?" James asked. "Vanessa," I said after another pause, "is more complicated. She's been the cruelest, the most consistently judgmental and dismissive. But that message suggests maybe she's actually facing some real truths about her life and choices. I think I respond and tell her I appreciate the apology, that I'm glad she's gaining some perspective, but that forgiveness and reconciliation will take a very long time if they happen at all." James nodded, understanding my need to set firm boundaries while still leaving a small door open for possible future healing. "That's fair," he said. "You don't owe her forgiveness just because she finally realized she was wrong, but you can acknowledge her apology without committing to anything more than that." I spent the next hour crafting careful responses to each message. To my parents, I expressed appreciation for their apology and willingness to change, while also being clear that rebuilding trust would require consistent action over time, not just words in the emotional aftermath of a dramatic evening. I told them I was willing to try, but that I needed to see genuine change in how they treated us and valued our choices. To Emily, I sent a heartfelt message about how proud we were of her, how much we loved her, and how honored we were to have her as our daughter and to have been able to give her the wedding she dreamed of. I told her that she and Marcus had our full support as they built their life together, and that we hoped they'd find the same deep partnership and authentic happiness that James and I had found. To Vanessa, I wrote the most carefully considered response. I acknowledged her apology and told her I appreciated her honesty about what she'd been feeling and realizing. But I also made it clear that 30 years of cruelty and judgment couldn't be erased by one moment of clarity or one apologetic message. I told her that if she was serious about changing and growing, I wished her well in that journey, but that I needed significant time and distance before I could consider any kind of relationship with her. I told her that her message suggested she was dealing with some deep unhappiness in her own life, and I hoped she'd get the help and support she needed to address that. but that I couldn't be the one to provide it. After sending those messages, James and I checked out of the hotel and drove back to the farm. It felt good to leave the city and the drama behind, to return to the land and the life we'd built together. The drive took us through increasingly rural landscape, past other farms and forests, gradually transitioning from urban sprawl to open countryside. When we pulled into our driveway and saw our comfortable farmhouse surrounded by orchards and fields, I felt a deep sense of peace and rightness. This was our home, our life, our sanctuary. It wasn't impressive in the way Vanessa's mansion was impressive, but it was real and authentic and filled with 30 years of memories and love. Over the next few weeks, life gradually returned to normal, though with some significant changes. The revelation of James's business success and wealth had spread through both our rural community and our family's social circles. People's reactions varied considerably and were quite revealing about their character. Some people in our farming community were completely unfazed, either because they'd already known or suspected, or because they'd never cared about our financial status in the first place. They valued James for his contributions to sustainable agriculture, his fair treatment of employees, his environmental stewardship, and his good character. The money was irrelevant to them. Other people suddenly became much friendlier and more interested in our lives, which was disappointing, but not surprising. We'd expected that some people would respond to our wealth rather than to us as individuals. We handled these fair-weather friends politely, but with firm boundaries, not allowing them closer access to our lives just because they'd suddenly decided we were worth knowing. In my family's social circle, reactions were mixed. Some people who'd looked down on us or dismissed us over the years now seemed embarrassed by their previous attitudes. Others doubled down on their judgment, suggesting that we'd been deceptive or dishonest by not being open about our success, as if we'd owed them some kind of financial disclosure. My parents, to their credit, did seem to be making genuine efforts to change and rebuild our relationship. They called regularly to check in, asked thoughtful questions about our lives and work, invited us to family gatherings without making snide comments about our lifestyle or choices. It was awkward at first. 30 years of distance and judgment don't disappear overnight, but gradually it started to feel more natural and authentic. They came to visit the farm for the first time since my wedding 30 years earlier, and I watched my mother's face as she took in the sprawling operation that James had built. The extensive orchards heavy with fruit, the neat rows of organic vegetables, the farm-to-table restaurant bustling with customers, the beautiful barn that hosted weddings and events. She actually had tears in her eyes as she turned to me. "I had no idea," she said softly. "I never understood what you and James had created here. I was so focused on my narrow definition of success that I couldn't see the remarkable life you'd built." "It's not too late to see it now," I said gently. "We're still here. The farm is still here. You can be part of this going forward if you want to." "I want to," she said firmly. "Your father and I both do. We've wasted too much time already." Vanessa was a different story. After I'd responded to her apologetic message, she'd sent a few more texts over the following weeks, each one showing a woman who was genuinely struggling with some major life realizations and regrets. She'd apparently started therapy, was having serious problems in her marriage to Richard, and was questioning many of the choices and values that had guided her life. I responded occasionally to her messages, always kindly but maintaining firm boundaries. I wasn't ready for more than that, might never be ready for more than that, and I felt no guilt about protecting myself from someone who'd been so consistently cruel for so long. One day, about 2 months after Emily's wedding, Vanessa asked if she could visit the farm, just for an afternoon, just to see the life I'd built and talk face to face. I discussed it with James, who left the decision entirely to me, and eventually I agreed to one supervised visit. Vanessa arrived looking different than I'd ever seen her, less polished, less perfectly put together, more vulnerable. She wasn't wearing designer clothes or expensive jewelry. She looked tired and sad and real, in a way she'd never allowed herself to look before. We walked around the farm together, me showing her the orchards and gardens and explaining the operation James had built. She asked genuine questions, expressed real interest, and for the first time in our lives, seemed to actually see me as a person, rather than as someone to judge or compete with. Eventually, we sat on the porch of the farmhouse with glasses of iced tea, looking out at the land stretching in front of us. Vanessa was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. "I've been so wrong about everything," she said softly. "Not just about you and James, but about what matters in life. I spent 30 years chasing things that don't actually bring happiness. Status, money, other people's approval. And I look at what you have. This beautiful partnership and this meaningful life. And I realize I have none of that despite all my supposed success. I'm sorry you're struggling," I said sincerely. "I really am. But Vanessa, you can't just suddenly want what I have now that you realize your path wasn't as satisfying as you expected. You have to do the work to figure out what you actually value and build a life around that." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "And I'm trying. But I wanted you to know how sorry I am. Not just for what I said at Emily's wedding, but for 30 years of cruelty and judgment. You were brave enough to choose love and authenticity over approval, and I mocked you for it because I was too scared to make that choice myself. I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "But Vanessa, this is going to take a long time. You can't erase 30 years of hurt with apologies, no matter how sincere. If you're serious about changing and growing, that's wonderful. But I need you to do that for yourself. Not because you want me to forgive you or give you access to the life you now think looks appealing." She nodded, wiping at her tears. "I understand. I'm not asking for forgiveness or for us to suddenly be close sisters. I just needed to say these things in person, and to see with my own eyes what I was too blind to see before." We talked for another hour before she left. It wasn't a reconciliation or a healing of our relationship, but it was perhaps the most honest conversation we'd ever had. Whether it would lead to anything more in the future remained to be seen. Emily and Marcus came to visit the farm frequently in the months following their wedding. They'd bought a house not too far away and were settling into married life beautifully. Emily had been offered a promotion at her job in environmental policy, and Marcus's consulting business was thriving. They were building their own version of success based on their values, just as James and I had done 3 decades earlier. One evening when they came for dinner, Emily brought up something she'd been thinking about. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been reflecting on what happened at the wedding and what it all meant. And I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about money or status or proving Aunt Vanessa wrong." "Oh?" I asked, curious where she was going with this. "The real lesson," Emily continued, "is that you and Dad built a life based on what mattered to you, regardless of what other people thought or said. You didn't try to prove your success to anyone. You didn't need validation or approval. You just lived according to your values and trusted that would be enough." Marcus nodded in agreement. "That's what we want to do too. Build something real and meaningful, not something impressive to others." James smiled at both of them. "That's all we've ever wanted, to live with integrity and authenticity, to do work that matters, to maintain relationships based on genuine connection rather than superficial criteria. The money was never the goal. It was just a side effect of doing good work and making smart decisions over time. And the best part," I added, "is that when you live that way, you never have to pretend to be someone you're not. You never have to worry about maintaining a facade or living up to others' expectations. You can just be yourself, and the people who matter will appreciate that." Emily and Marcus left that evening with thoughtful expressions, clearly processing these ideas about success and authenticity and values-based living. I was proud of how they were approaching their life together, proud that they'd internalized the lessons James and I had tried to teach through our example. As the months turned into a year after Emily's wedding, life settled into a new normal. My relationship with my parents continued to slowly improve as they proved through consistent action that they genuinely changed their perspective and priorities. We'd never be as close as we might have been if they'd been supportive from the beginning. But we were building something new that had its own value. Vanessa and I maintained occasional contact, but nothing approaching a close relationship. She was doing her own work in therapy, had separated from Richard, and was trying to figure out who she was when she wasn't measuring herself by external standards of success. I hoped she'd find peace and authenticity eventually, but I'd accepted that our relationship might never be more than cordial and distant. The farm continued to thrive under James's management. We expanded our sustainable agriculture programs, provided even more jobs to the community, and continued donating quietly to causes we cared about. James was increasingly recognized as a leader in environmental farming practices, though he remained characteristically humble about these accolades. I continued teaching part-time at the local high school because I genuinely loved working with students, not because we needed the income. Some of my students knew about our family's success now, but most still just saw me as Mrs. Thornton, the English teacher who genuinely cared about helping them learn and grow. 2 years after Emily's wedding, we got news that we were going to be grandparents. Emily announced her pregnancy at a family dinner that included my parents, and the joy and excitement in the room was genuine and beautiful. I watched my mother's face light up with happiness, and I saw in that moment how much she'd changed from the woman who'd been so disappointed in my choices 30 years earlier. Later that evening, after everyone had left and James and I were cleaning up, he pulled me into his arms in the middle of our kitchen. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly, seeing the reflective expression on my face. "I was just thinking about how full circle everything has come," I said. 30 years ago, my family rejected you and our life together. At Emily's wedding 2 years ago, they finally saw what we'd built and had to confront their own prejudices and mistakes. And now we're all coming together to celebrate new life and new generations. It feels like healing, or at least the beginning of it. James kissed my forehead gently. "You gave them that chance to heal, Catherine. You could have stayed angry and closed off, and no one would have blamed you. But you left the door open for growth and change. That takes real strength and grace." "I learned from you," I said, looking up at him. "You never let their judgment make you bitter or angry. You just kept being who you were, living according to your values, trusting that would be enough. And it always was." We stood there in our comfortable kitchen, in our beloved farmhouse, on our thriving farm, holding each other in the quiet of the evening. Outside, the orchard stretched into the darkness, heavy with fruit waiting to be harvested. Above us, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. This life we'd built together, this partnership spanning 3 decades, this commitment to authenticity and integrity and love, this was success in its truest form. Not the money, not the property, not the business empire James had quietly created. Those things were nice, certainly, but they were just the scaffolding. The real structure, the real achievement, was the life we'd built inside that scaffolding, a life of meaning and purpose and genuine connection. Vanessa had finally realized this truth, though it had taken her 30 years and a dramatic public confrontation to see it. My parents had come to understand it too, though later than they should have. But James and I had known it all along. We'd chosen it deliberately when we chose each other over my family's approval, and we'd proven it every day since through the choices we made and the life we lived. Looking back now, I wouldn't change a single thing. Not the struggles, not the judgment, not the years of distance from my family. All of it had been necessary to build something real and lasting. All of it had led us to this moment, standing in our kitchen, about to become grandparents, surrounded by a life we'd created together based on love and shared values. Vanessa had said in one of her messages that I'd won, that I'd always won. But that framing still missed the point entirely. It was never a competition. There was no winning or losing. There was only choosing authentically, living with integrity, and building something meaningful with someone you loved. We'd done that, James and I. We'd done exactly that for 30 years, and we'd keep doing it for however many years we had left. The dirt-poor farmer my sister had mocked turned out to be a multimillionaire businessman. But that reveal, that dramatic moment of vindication at Emily's wedding, was really just a footnote in a much larger story about what actually matters in life. The money proved we'd been successful by conventional measures, but the real proof of our success was the life itself, the partnership, the values, the love, the meaning, the authenticity, and no bank account, no property portfolio, no business empire could ever be worth more than that.